Well, good morning. You awake? I'm the one that's 9 hours off of my time clock here. First, gracias to my dear friend Stefan for his invitation and to Jacques for the wonderful and warm welcome we've received here. And a special thanks to the students. They've been working really hard behind the scenes, making everything happen. They're amazing, and I'm grateful for you. And they're also so curious and open. And for me, having students to speak with is always the best thing. I also want to welcome all of the women here. I just come from the Women of the Church Conference in the United States, and I want to say that I am very glad to see so many women. And would you stand up so everyone else can acknowledge the fact that you're the future of the church? Thank you, my sisters, for being here. So, you know, it's a popular position that what we're doing here is really illegitimate. On the one hand, we hear that religion and politics cannot mix and should be kept separate because religion is a private affair. On the other, we're told that religion, bound by fundamentalist interpretations, must indiscriminately impose those on the world. There are places that outlaw all religion, places that impose one religion over others, and places that foster religious conflicts. And in the end, what all of these have in common is that they sideline theological inquiry, reducing religious traditions to labels and fights over power, and hindering informed critical thought that can shed light on beliefs as these become actions that affect our common life. So to put theos and polis together is to say that what we believe about fundamental questions affects how we act, and how we act affects the world. So what we're doing here matters greatly. So if, as our conference theme suggests, political theology is dedicated to exploring and clarifying how the church contributes to the efforts of giving shape to our common life in a way that is coherent with planetary flourishing, then the thrust of a political theology is oriented toward Jesus's incessantly communicated obsession, the vision of el reino de Dios, the reign of God. What I have experienced over the last few years as a U.S. Latina theologian accompanying immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers inside what Latino theologians call la realidad, the messy tangle of daily life where God works in history, is an overwhelming attack on that vision of the reign that we as a church affirm shimmers throughout salvation history. The situation of displaced persons in the world changes daily. And as I worked on this, I realized I could not address these as I would want. So rather than acquainting us with the situation, which we need to do daily, I want to focus on how we got here and what theological thought can contribute to unmasking the problem, so we may at least resist and at the most give our communities the tools to undo what is happening. I will proceed by focusing on the rise to power of Donald Trump and how his candidacy and presidency shifted policies and worldviews about vulnerable people, especially immigrants. Although my inquiry is focused on the US, we know that the Trumpian worldview has spread and emboldened similarly constructed political calculations globally. Although I'm not suggesting that there was a careful plan behind his rise other than the consolidation of power through any means, I do believe that a theological aesthetics analysis yields how Trumpism eviscerated ethical judgment and action by destroying the fundamental religious commitments of solidarity and kinship. So I begin with Trump's rise to power. On June 16, 2015, a real estate developer and television celebrity emerged at the top of a golden escalator, accompanied by his third wife, a model 24 years his junior. Music blared as the mechanical stairs glided them down to a platform in the lobby of the Manhattan building branded with Trump's name. At once smiling and menacing, Donald J. Trump launched into a speech to declare his intention of running for president of the United States. After exaggerating the size of the crowd, Trump exclaimed, "Our country is in serious trouble." Fear, which journalist Bob Woodward later used as the title of his book on the Trump presidency, was thus unveiled as the strategy to propel this candidate to the presidency. As Woodward quotes Trump, "Real power is," I don't even want to use the word, "fear." The politics of fear would be central to Trump's playbook, but fear alone wouldn't work in a country with a high standard of living, claiming to be a robust and paradigmatic democracy. The context was simply not amenable to the unvarnished politics of fear deployed successfully so often in history. To the contrary, the national context on that June day was stable and optimistic. By the time he left the White House, and despite the continued sin of racism plaguing the United States, a majority of people felt positive about having elected their first black president. On taking office in 2009, as the deregulated financial markets of the Bush administration collapsed, Barack Obama's administration had taken unprecedented steps to stabilize the US economy and prevent a global depression. At the time of Trump's announcement, the economy continued on a moderate growth trajectory and was well underway to a full recovery. So although Trump wanted to stoke fear, he was addressing a prosperous country, rich with diversity and a growing sense of the dynamism and interconnectedness of the world. The real estate developer had to find a way to seize control of a nation with constitutionally guaranteed freedoms and concentrate power in his hands, in direct contradiction to the country's image of itself as the land of the free and the brave. That morning, coming down the golden escalator, Trump needed a recipe of his own making, which mixed in all we know about the politics of fear and added some new and potent ingredients. In order to succeed, Trumpism's fear-driven appeal to power had to target human solidarity. The candidate had to undermine it so thoroughly that his voters would hand over power and follow him blindly. From our vantage point, we could say that the targets were truth and goodness, the basis of ethical action. But how to destabilize these? Trumpism's answer was to deploy an imposter that had been spreading its influence globally for decades and had been the basis of Trump's fame. The attack was on beauty, and the imposter was Trump's only real asset, glamour. It worked, and here's why. The Christian tradition has long held that beauty is an effective pointer to its source and sustainer, God. Clearly expressed in Augustine's exclamation in the Confessions, "Late have I loved you thee, O beauty, so ancient and so new. Late have I loved thee." generations of thinkers have grappled with the question of beauty's role in creation and salvation. However, in recent years, talk of beauty has been neglected, taking our attunement to beauty for granted. On the basis of our cathedrals and great works of art, the church had paid little attention to how beauty forms and informs consciences. In the community of the beautiful, theologian Alex Garcia Rivera noticed an insight from semiotics theory with important theological implications. Following the 19th century American logician Charles Sanders Peirce, Garcia Rivera observed how the philosopher had struggled in his early work because he could only account for a judgment of value about the world, what Garcia Rivera terms the community of the true. As he explains, quote, Peirce's logic of science had given a satisfying answer to the question of how the true becomes discovered, but left open the implicit question of what inspires such discovery in the first place. Missing was the question of what initiated such a pursuit of truth and also what guided it once begun. So as they worked to close this gap, the pragmatist philosophers concluded that actions, to be logical, must be guided, initiated by ends. The possibility of subverting what initiates and guides the actions of the electorate so they would have no independent thought and be guided only by him, this is the ingredient Trumpism accidentally discovered. Trumpism had to replace what Garcia Rivera expresses as the radical interconnectedness of human experience. For the theologian, quote, when guidance is given to the community of the true, it reveals itself to the community, to be the community of the good as well. When inspiration generates the community of the true and the good, then the community of the beautiful is revealed as well. What becomes evident is that while beauty inspires and guides the search for truth and goodness, it is also generated by truth and goodness, so as to form a circular process of ongoing ethical revelation within aesthetic effulgence. It was this interconnectedness of truthfulness and goodness, initiated and guided by beauty, that Trumpism subverted, replacing beauty with a counterfeit version of it. The impostor had served Trump well all his life, and now it had a new stage. Beauty would be replaced by glamour, but why glamour? Could it be as powerfully motivating and controlling as fear, but much more subtle? Could it lead away from God rather than towards God? A few years after the breakthrough of the pragmatists, the Chicago-based pastor and theologian von Ogden Vogt responded to the horrors of 2 world wars, noting how these events had followed humanity's age of enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the optimism of science, and the belief in something called progress. He didn't call it glamour, but denounced the false sense of human prowess and hubris that had led to the wars, correlating the material destruction of the war with the devastation of overconfident intellectual constructions built on shaky ground. During a time not unlike our own, von Ogdenvold writes, "A new age is coming. It will be upon us swiftly, and we must bestir our imaginations to prepare for it. We are like the dwellers in the war-swept areas of the old world whose homes were wrecked by shell fire. Our intellectual houses are falling about our ears. We do not yet know whether we must rebuild them or desert them. We are hurriedly wondering what to save from the wreckage. We are half unconsciously taking stock of our valuables, making new appraisals of what is most precious. It is a time of re-examination of all things, a time of changes, profound and universal. The disorganization of normal life by the Great War has compelled a new openness of mind and roused new demands for a better life." What insight presents a choice? Continue on the road of making wars on each other and effectively end human history? Or rediscover why our world, why we might be worth preserving? Echoing the pragmatists, Vaught saw that the only way back from the precipice of death was the rediscovery of the life-giving power of experiences of beauty, and thus have beauty do the work of pointing incessantly back toward the good and the true, guiding our ethical action back toward God. Vaught stresses two things. First, he argues that humanity's legacy of creative making across the ages provides unquestionable evidence that to have a full life, human beings require beauty, truth, and goodness. God's creation is deeply beautiful, true, and good, and human beings are somehow mysteriously made to value and desire these attributes. To intentionally keep ourselves tethered to beauty, truth, and goodness is to remember who we are as children of God. His second insight builds on this. Vaught argues that the ethics of life are inseparable from the aesthetics of life. He discerns the simultaneity of ethical judgment and aesthetic longing, declaring that what we call ethics is, quote, the struggle of human life to have a larger share in the beauty of life, end quote. What his insight makes clear is that if the content of ethics is effectively revealed by the desire for beauty, to supplant beauty with something else will essentially extinguish ethics. A couple of decades after Vaught, the awakening of civil rights movements in the world coinciding with the Second Vatican Council once more demonstrated that the appearance of prosperity and progress was a deception. There was a pervasive disconnect in the world, and the Council noticed it, even if it was unable to name it. Never has the human race enjoyed such an abundance of wealth, resources, and economic power, and yet a huge proportion of the world's citizens are still tormented by hunger and poverty, while countless numbers suffer from total illiteracy. Never before has the human person had so keen an understanding of freedom, yet at the same time, new forms of social and psychological slavery make their appearance. Although the world of today has a very vivid awareness of its unity and how one person depends on another in needful solidarity, it is most grievously torn into opposing camps by conflicting forces. For political, social, economic, racial, and ideological disputes still continue bitterly. And with them, the peril of a war which would reduce everything to ashes. That's Gaudium et Spes, section 4. The conflict between life and death, war and peace, solidarity, and the dehumanization of others continued unabated. And Pope Paul VI summarized the challenge in the title of his address on Peace Day in 1972. His words, made art by Corita Kent, proclaimed to the world, if you want peace, work for justice. Yet he failed to see that without the link to aesthetics, the difficulty of activating and guiding ethical life persisted. Paul VI was overconfident in the Christian blueprint for what constitutes justice, most centrally present in Matthew 25 and the Beatitudes. What La Realidad reveals is that the world is not made up of only or even primarily Christians. And what's more, Christians seem willing to disregard the radical nature of solidarity required by the scriptures and the tradition. How do we proclaim and do justice when we don't agree on what it is, because our own gain and well-being are all that guide us? 3 decades after Paul VI, John Paul II concludes his pastoral letter to artists with a section enigmatically titled, "The Beauty That Saves." The Pope, a poet all his life, hints at a profound truth, but like Paul VI, takes for granted much that is far from settled. He writes poetically that, quote, "Beauty is a key to the mystery and a call to transcendence. It is an invitation to savor life and to dream of the future." He asserts that beauty invites and calls, or in Garcia Rivera's words, beauty initiates and guides us to the common good. But John Paul II doesn't perceive how beauty itself can be subvertive through its faint presence. Vaught told us that to be human is to crave beauty, truth, and goodness. Gaudium et Spes pointed to the drastic lack of beauty, truth, and goodness in the world and called the church to engage the world's wounded state in solidarity. Soon after, Paul VI told us that the road to peace would be built by justice. And then John Paul II told us that beauty saves, pretty much tracing a circle right back to Vaught's assertions about the continuity between aesthetics and ethics. What this reveals is that the ethical is rendered inert without the aesthetic. In other words, if you want peace, work for justice, is incomplete without adding, if you want justice, work for beauty. And for that to actually work, we must know true beauty and unmask the imposter. However, let me add another note of caution about the ways we tend to speak of beauty, because if we do not, we have significantly reduced beauty's power to reveal what is just. I'm speaking of beauty's absence. Just as beauty can move us to pursue it, as Augustine asserts, as it reveals the concentric circles of the communities made up by truth and goodness, as Garcia Rivera points out, beauty's absence is also an exceedingly effective pointer, perhaps even more powerful than beauty. The starkness of the absence of beauty cannot be feigned or co-opted. John Paul II hints at this when, having spent most of his letter extolling beauty, he finally admits that, quote, "Even when they explore the darkest depths of the soul or the most unsettling aspects of evil, artists give voice in a way to the universal desire for redemption," end quote. This is precisely the opening and guide to ethical judgment and action offered by the absence of beauty. And it is why everything in Trumpism is manufactured to present a thin veneer of false gold. The power of heartbreak can be just as potent an initiator and guide toward truth and goodness as is the delight and transcendence of beauty. If there has been an effective resistance to Trump's draconian excesses, it has been activated and guided precisely by the sight of dead migrant children and parents ripped away from their arms. This should come as no surprise to Christians who intentionally contemplate and venerate the image of a tortured and bleeding man. Especially following Francis of Assisi's reforms, the image of Christ on the cross was no longer solely the sign of God's love and sacrifice for humanity. It became the focus for humanity's own compassion for the suffering Savior. The Christian was not only to glory in the triumph of the cross, but to courageously enter into the horror of suffering alongside Christ in order to cultivate a sense for seeking and building justice by contemplating its most abject absence on that same cross. The tradition reveals that both beauty and its heartbreaking absence initiate, guide, and sustain humanity's desire to work for truth and goodness. Actions, to be logical, must be guided, indeed initiated, by ends. Back to Trump on his shiny escalator, what he presented was definitely not ugly, but abundant, golden, powerful. The master of all he surveyed, he could make full use of the politics of fear, but only by diligently obscuring beauty's ability to initiate and guide truth and goodness. The best way to do this had been honed in the United States by years of reality television, Trump's only area of expertise. The genre thrives on presenting glamour and then stoking envy, deception, materialism, and the drive toward domination. As television shows, glamour was proven effective in breaking down human solidarity. For Trump's white nationalism to triumph, those with the least shiny golden things, the immigrant, refugee, poor, and sick, had to be trampled. In chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis, the collapse of human solidarity is center stage as the sin that disrupts humanity's bond with each other and with God. We can spend time speculating about the meaning of the tree of life or the knowledge of good and evil, or continue building up the patriarchy by blaming Eve. But for me, these miss the point. The myriad prohibitions, the serpent, tree, fruit, eating, fig leaves, all of these function to set the stage and build the action until God asks the central question, a simple one most parents recognize. Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? For a parent, as for the figure of God in this story, this is a rhetorical question. The parent knows. God certainly knows. Does God want to see what the humans will do after being caught? Will coveting favor and advantage from God make them turn on each other? Or will they care and sacrifice for each other? The devastating answer comes quickly, as Adam's betrayal of his wife is swift. His desire to shift blame from himself, which might diminish his standing in God's eyes, obliterates any kingship he may have felt with the woman. As the story recounts, her well-being does not even enter into his calculations. If someone is to be blamed and punished, it will be Eve. By betraying her, he believes he will be exonerated and his privileged status will be untarnished. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree and I ate. Adam is the first informant and breaks his bond with Eve. Eve, for her part, is more compassionate toward Adam, blaming the serpent. What ensues after this pivotal moment is the unleashing of God's heartbroken disappointment, resulting in the banishment of the humans from the garden, the place where they could walk with each other and with God. The call to right relationship and solidarity and its constant breakdown is a signal theme throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, as is the insistence on the role that the usness of God's people plays in their deliverance. As Isaiah announces on the day when every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain and hill made low, and the uneven ground shall become level and the rough places plain, then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together. The scriptural memory is clear. Giving in to scapegoating others will bar us from the garden. And unless we arrive at it together, we will not see the glory of God. Was glamour ultimately to blame for the fall? Is coveting our own advantage at the expense of the other the swiftest way to get us to betray each other? The baptismal rite preserves the memory of this insight as the elect are asked to gather the questions. Do you reject sin as to live in the freedom of God's children? Do you reject the glamour of evil and refuse to be mastered by sin? Evil hides behind glamour, leading us away from truth and goodness and making us desire it rather than beauty. We will forget our freedom as God's children and, lured away from the good and the true, will allow evil to become our master. Finally, it is in the Christian scriptures that the reversal of the original condition of broken relationships brought about by our selfishness is expressed in all its fullness. The opposite of the sin of Adam and Eve is presented most clearly as Jesus answers, "Which is the greatest commandment, and what must be done to inherit eternal life?" Jesus does not say, you need to give up your knowledge of good and evil, or you need to give up wanting to be like God. No, the answer is as extraordinary as it is simple. What you must do is love God and neighbor with complete abandon. Both, not one or the other, both. In following this action, the betrayal of kingship of Adam and Eve is undone, and the image of God as love is restored. Matthew and Luke insist that our ultimate act of loving God is to make God as love present as we unconditionally and fully love each other. But as all things with Jesus, this is not merely talk. Jesus' life and violent death add the ultimate reversal to the condition of disloyalty and broken relationships to our human history. He dies as a direct result of betrayal, trampled under by the glamour of Rome and the collusion of the temple elite. He is abandoned, forgotten, marked as a criminal. It is this act of starkly unveiling our selfishness, followed by his altruism, that unleashes resurrected love in history, just as its opposite had unleashed alienation. The measure of beauty then becomes Christ on the cross, giving up his life for his friends, while commanding us to love one another as he has loved us. Christian love, guided by such beauty, can have no conditions. And because of this, it is untamable and incorruptible. So back to Trump Tower. After declaring the country in serious trouble, but without evidence to support him, the would-be strongman set out to break solidarity. He couldn't do it with war, hunger, or civil unrest, so he needed glamour. And this was the only thing the reality television salesman actually knew how to do. The rest of his announcement speech reveals the relentless dissolution of the three interlaced communities of the good, true, and beautiful through recasting everything in a different light. First, identify enemies, not because they're making war or restricting human rights, but because they have more than us. And if they have more, then we are less wealthy, and American glamour will slip away. Trump attacks China, Japan, and Mexico, repeating that they beat us and kill us, using words of violence for financial transactions. He warns that terrorists have become rich, not that they kill. And to make his audience even more vulnerable, he heightens their insecurities, repeating that everyone is laughing at us and at our stupidity. Finally, Trump invents a new enemy by creating a category of other on whom to heap darkness, suffering, frailty, and want. He could point his finger and say beneath his bombastic rhetoric, "You do not ever want to be like this black, brown, poor, suffering person. The very opposite of the glamour I promise you. Follow me." The salesman offers glamour, personalized in him and his constant boast of wealth and power to protect his followers from the others, those Emma Lazarus described over a century before as the tired, poor, huddled masses, the wretched refuse of other shores. By making his voters covet the promised invulnerability of glamour, Trump had finally found a reason for them to want to close the golden door. Trump takes the neighbor to the south, whose lands the United States invaded by force 167 years before, and scapegoats everything onto them. He claims Mexicans are bringing drugs, bringing crime, and are rapists. During the campaign and in the years since, brown and black people will be chased out of parks, stores, restaurants, and their own apartment buildings by whites, emboldened by Trump's subverted aesthetics, which make only the white race desirable, equating whiteness with American exceptionalism and the glamour of power, destroying any possibility that beauty may ignite ethical action. Trumpism defines the other as unworthy, based on intrinsic aesthetic attributes lacking glamour, easily identifiable, and beyond the control of the one marked and coded. To be poor, brown, black, a refugee, or a mixture of these will be to be undesirable. And this new identity, placed by Trumpism on the most vulnerable of the world, is remarkably effective in thwarting human solidarity and the possibility of heartbreak resulting in altruism. With this final stroke, Trumpism connected glamour to fear, Glamour, the imposter, built up by deception and materialism, replacing beauty, and thus effectively initiating and guiding xenophobia, jingoism, and white supremacy. His promise of safety from being contaminated through the brown, black, poor, and immigrant sets up a hierarchy of values completely untethered from anything other than personal advantage. The America First doctrine Trump introduces behind the veil of waving flags and red hats proposes and encourages violations not only of international law, but of the actual 10 Commandments. And many of his followers and members of his own party look the other way. His message about other countries will become to covet what they have. He also proposes stealing from others for economic gain, the currency of mimetic desire. He encourages bearing false witness as the best way to create a hall of mirrors where what is true no longer matters. In a remarkable data point, as of June 7th of 2019, his 869th day in office, news analysts had clocked Trump in at 10,796 lies. But it is the commandments against glamour, graven images, idolatry, and taking God's name in vain that he will most completely negate. The vulnerable within our shores and beyond them, God's most beloved and protected, are the sacrifice that Trump, who demands absolute fealty, promises will guarantee America's renewed racial purity and dominance. I don't know how we turn the tide, but perhaps by beginning at exposing glamour's lies, we might make real the vision of the reign, where the last will be first and the first will be last, by building up human solidarity. Thank you.